So where did this idea that we need to restrict our salt intake even come from? When a dietary guideline is set for an entire population, you'd hope that it would be based on the highest possible level of clinical evidence, which is a systematic review of randomized controlled clinical trials. But back in the 70s, when the first salt restriction guidelines were set, that kind of evidence didn't exist for salt. It was based on what they called expert opinion. In the early 1900s is when researchers started publishing about case reports that they had found where increased salt intake led to higher blood pressure in some people. But conflicting studies were also being published around that time. And throughout the early 1900s, we sort of see this salt debate going on, where researchers are conflicted about whether it's necessary to restrict your salt intake for optimal health. Fears around salt really escalated in the 60s and 70s due to a very prominent anti-salt researcher by the name of Lewis Dahl. Lewis Dahl did an epidemiological review of salt intake across 6 countries, and he found that in countries that tend to eat a lot more salt, such as Japan, those countries also tended to have higher levels of hypertension and stroke. But as a later paper that was published in the American Journal of Hypertension pointed out, if you looked within those countries, you didn't see that same correlation, indicating that there must be some other confounding variables at play, such as genetics or environmental or cultural factors or other dietary considerations. When Dahl tried to prove his hypothesis in rodents in lab studies, he found that when you chronically feed rats a very high salt diet, only some of them develop varying degrees of hypertension. So what Dahl did was he selectively bred 2 genetic lines of rats, salt-sensitive rats and salt-resistant rats. And he found that only in the salt-sensitive rats did reducing salt intake improve blood pressure. In the salt-resistant rats, no matter how much salt they were fed, they didn't develop hypertension. From his findings, Dahl postulated that humans would have varying responses to different levels of salt intake. But in order to keep hypertension relatively uncommon at a population level, humans should restrict their salt intake to below a certain amount. And his findings largely drove the first salt restriction guidelines that were set in 1977 in America. This sort of injected the fear of salt into people's minds, and even though much more sophisticated, newer research has been done since then, it's been so difficult to shake this idea that salt is bad for us, because it's become such an ingrained part of the way we think about salt. In 2021, there was a large review of sodium done across the world, and it concluded that between 3,000 and 5,000 milligrams of sodium per day was associated with the lowest risk of adverse health outcomes, including cardiovascular events. Yet, as of 2024, the current dietary guideline is to restrict sodium intake to less than 2,300 milligrams a day for healthy people and less than 1,500 milligrams a day for those with high blood pressure. And the rationale behind this is that some people seem to be hypersensitive to salt. So to sort of hedge our bets at a population level, let's rather take the ultra cautious approach and get everyone to restrict their sodium intake. Instead of asking why might some individuals be hypersensitive to salt? And one of the primary reasons that people respond poorly to salt is because of magnesium and potassium deficiencies. So in order to protect against hypertension, instead of encouraging people to restrict their salt intake, we should really be encouraging people to make sure they're getting enough magnesium and potassium. We place such a hyper focus on too much salt intake that the side effects of too little salt intake are rarely spoken about. And that's one of the biggest problems in nutrition research in general. We tend to isolate one food and look at its short-term effect on one health marker, and then use that association to make broad-based generalizations about that food's effect on our overall health. Whereas we need to be considering that food's effect on other health markers. So with salt, we've had this hyper-focus on blood pressure, but what about salt's effect on other aspects of our health? When we reduce our salt intake, the amount of sodium in the blood decreases, and that causes an immediate reduction in blood volume and blood pressure. And that's why reducing salt intake is recommended for those with high blood pressure. But we need to remember that having adequate blood pressure is extremely important for our health. Having adequate blood pressure is what allows oxygen and nutrients to be transported throughout the body. Having adequate blood pressure is what allows waste products to get transferred out of our body. So when blood pressure is acutely reduced due to a lack of salt intake, the body has to compensate to keep your blood pressure at a healthy level. And it does that by activating the body's stress systems. So the body's stress systems constrict our blood vessels and release a stress hormone called aldosterone. And that signals to the kidneys to excrete less sodium. So that helps us maintain adequate sodium and water levels in our blood and keeps our blood pressure at a healthy level so that our bodies can transport nutrients and oxygen around the body. Although that compensation is beneficial in the short term, in the long term it comes at a cost. The sodium that would have normally been excreted in the kidneys gets replaced by magnesium and potassium. So when we don't eat enough salt, we lose greater amounts of magnesium and potassium. And in the long run, a magnesium and potassium deficiency can contribute to high blood pressure. Magnesium and potassium are responsible for so many aspects of our health. They're involved in muscle function, nerve signaling, blood glucose control. So having enough salt allows us to maintain healthy levels of those other electrolytes. Salt also creates hydrochloric acid or stomach acid, and that is needed to break down, digest, and absorb the nutrients in our stomach. Having adequate stomach acid also helps to ward off viruses and bacteria. So in that way, having enough salt protects us against infection. Low salt intake can also trigger insulin resistance, and this has been shown to happen even in previously healthy individuals. One reason for this is that one of the transporters that helps get carbohydrates into our cells, called the sodium glucose transporter, is dependent on having enough sodium. So when we don't eat enough salt, it can be harder to store carbohydrates or glucose in the cell, even when insulin is released. Salt is beneficial for our metabolism because it is thermogenic. In other words, it helps keep our body temperature at an optimal level. And this means that salt is also important for our immunity and to keep inflammation down, because even a slight dip in our body temperature promotes inflammation in the body and can reduce the body's immune function. Salt can play a major role in mental health issues, including depression and anxiety. And this is because almost every single neurotransmitter requires sodium to get in and out of the cell. Sodium also helps drive vitamin C into the brain, which helps to reduce oxidative stress in the brain. And many people with mood disorders have high levels of oxidative stress in the brain. In fact, sodium is necessary to drive vitamin C into any organ. Salt is incredibly important to get enough of during pregnancy because salt helps support the blood volume expansion that happens during pregnancy. During pregnancy, the blood volume expands by about 45%. And this is necessary to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the fetus. So when we misguidedly restrict our salt intake during pregnancy, our blood volume might not expand as it should, and this restricts the growth of the placenta and therefore restricts the delivery of nutrients and oxygen to the baby. The prevalence of preeclampsia is actually higher in women who restrict their salt intake during pregnancy. Dr. Tom Brewer was an obstetrician that devoted his whole career to prenatal nutrition, and he was a big advocate for getting enough salt during pregnancy. He was largely responsible for the gradual abandonment of low salt plus diuretics treatment during pregnancy. Interestingly, non-pregnant women who have low sodium intakes of less than 1,500 milligrams per day have been shown to have lower progesterone levels. One study showed that women who restrict their salt intake have 37% lower progesterone than women who don't restrict their salt intake. So if you are looking to support your fertility and support your hormone health, restricting salt intake is definitely not what you need to do. For breastfeeding moms, it is also important to get enough salt. Many breastfeeding moms are told to drink lots of water to boost their milk supply, But too much water without enough salt is actually a recipe for dehydration. And that's because too much water can mimic a low sodium environment, which kicks in the body's stress response and causes us to waste magnesium and potassium. So what breastfeeding women really should be prioritizing is electrolyte-rich fluids, including sodium, magnesium, potassium, and calcium, instead of just plain water. When it comes to infant nutrition, almost every resource out there warns against using any amount of salt in baby food preparation. And the rationale for this is often that it will harm their kidneys, or it will predispose them to high blood pressure later in life, or it will predispose them to craving saltier foods later in life. But all of these claims are surprisingly based on very weak evidence. In fact, some data shows that by 4 months of age, babies' kidneys have matured to the point where they can handle and excrete sodium. The research that claims that sodium is bad for babies mostly looked at babies who were introduced to solids very early as 1 to 3 months. So if we follow the standard recommendation of waiting to introduce solids to 6 months, the idea that we need to be hyper vigilant about salt intake for babies is not really founded. So how much salt should we be eating? Well, our taste is a remarkable sense, and studies show that we crave more salt when our bodies have a higher need for salt. So salting your food to taste is a good starting point. In 2021, a large review of sodium intake was done across the world, and they found that between 3,000 and 5,000 milligrams of sodium per day was associated with the lowest incidence of adverse health outcomes, including cardiovascular events. In 2021, a large review of sodium intakes across the world indicated that between 3,000 and 5,000 milligrams of sodium per day was associated with the lowest risk of adverse health outcomes, including cardiovascular events. A lot of processed foods contain a lot of sodium, so if you are eating a diet that is low in processed foods, you actually need to make sure that you are getting enough salt. Other things that might increase your needs for salt include exercise, if you're sweating a lot, and stress. When we are stressed, we excrete higher amounts of sodium. So again, salting your food to taste is a good way to meet your sodium needs. Importantly, you should also aim to have at least 3 grams of potassium a day, because potassium helps our bodies regulate sodium levels. When we talk about getting enough salt, what we really mean is getting enough natural salt. Salt as it comes directly from the earth. When you look at table salt, it is salt that has been chemically cleaned and processed to the point that it is almost 100% pure sodium chloride. And this means that we are missing out on all the natural minerals that come in salt directly from the earth. So salt from the earth will have higher levels of magnesium, potassium, and other important minerals. Table salt also often has many additives. So one of the main additives that is often added to table salt is an anti-caking agent, and this is to ensure that the salt doesn't clump together and flows more easily. There are different types of anti-caking agents used, but many of them have been linked to negative health outcomes. Table salt is also often iodized, and while iodine is important to get enough of, it's a very delicate balance with iodine. It is also possible to get too much iodine. The iodine is usually added in the form of potassium iodide, sodium iodide, or sodium iodate. And that form of iodine is not stable. It will evaporate immediately. So an additive needs to be put in the salt to stabilize the iodine. And that additive is usually dextrose, which is a form of glucose. So essentially you're getting a bit of sugar in your salt. And then in some countries, fluoride is also added to salt. And excess fluoride has been associated with dental fluorosis, skeletal fluorosis, arthritis, osteoporosis, and other joint issues. Why I am particularly a fan of desert salt as opposed to sea salt is because unfortunately our oceans have been contaminated with a lot of heavy metals and plastics. So when we consume sea salt, we have a higher chance of getting exposed to microplastics and levels of heavy metals that have been shown to be in excess of what is healthy for human consumption. Why I particularly like white desert salt as opposed to some of the pink salts you get is because pink salt has its sort of red color in part due to iron oxide, or in other words rust, which in excess is also not great for human consumption.